Good morning, everyone. Today I'm out here at Oakwood Cemetery to bring you part 4 of the Layman's Guide to Headstones series that I've been doing recently. Now, today we're starting over here nearby the Confederate section, but we won't be really covering the Confederate section much at all in this video. Instead, we'll be focusing our attention over here towards the nearby section, which is the often known as the baby section, which, as the name suggests, is full of the final resting places of children, infants, and babies who passed away far too soon in some people's regards. And in particular, we're going to be covering one type of headstone that will be quite commonplace throughout these sorts of sections, and also throughout many of these older cemeteries dating back before the 1930s and 1940s. And that will be the icon of the lamb. Now, to explain a little bit about it before we cover any of some of the examples that we have out here, the lamb itself is often used as a symbol of innocence, particularly that of childhood innocence, which is why for headstones starting especially around the early 20th century, the lamb would become extremely popular among the usage of these headstones for young children, because as the lamb is a symbol of innocence, it represents the childhood innocence that we all at one point had, which unfortunately for some was robbed from them at a very early age. So we'll start with a couple of examples over here. I may end up having to go out of the cemetery, this section of the cemetery, towards some of the other sections to show some of the far better examples, and then discuss what eventually happened to the symbol itself and its general history. We'll start with this example here, which belongs to I believe that is a Nassim El Hani, who was born May 14th, 1910, and unfortunately died on July 3rd, 1911, barely a little bit over a year old. Now, in this example, what you can see is that the lamb is portrayed at the top, and in this case, it's carved into the stone itself. It is sort of a little creche carved into this into this standing headstone. Now, a part of the reason why the lamb is used, as I said before, is because it represents childhood innocence. It represents a sense of purity that we can't truly quantify. And the reason why this is used is because for these particular graves in question, these are very young children, usually, sometimes babies, even sometimes as young as a few days old, who've passed on. And so as a result, this entire symbolism of using a symbol of purity, of childhood innocence, becomes more commonplace, especially starting around the 20th century, where this becomes extremely popular among the usage of headstones, where in the early 20th century, the mortality rate of children was significantly higher than what it is today, where it is close to or near to 0%. There are a few child mortality cases even today, but it's extremely rare. However, back then, even all the way back towards, let's say, the middle of the 19th century, child mortality rates were upwards of 50%. More often than not, a lot of these children would end up contracting different diseases, such as, say, for example, malaria is a common one. Tuberculosis is another example. These sorts of diseases that end up cutting their life short and very early. And this would end up continuing on well into the 20th century, such as in this case where you have this young child who died in 1911, which, when we think of 1911, we think of the mass development of technology and the rapid industrialization of the world. But even then, during this time, medicine was still very much developing towards its modern standards. And even then, there were still issues where they couldn't treat certain conditions that today are far more easily treatable. And as a result, it was common for children to pass away at a young age. And as a result of this common, fairly high mortality rate, there was a high demand for headstones just like this one. So we're going to continue on and see a few other examples of the lamb being displayed in these headstones. And I'll talk a little bit more about these different examples as well. This example belongs to a Helen Sunshine Isaacs, who was born in 1906 and then passed away in 1915, barely 9 years old. Now, this headstone type is actually one of the more common types that you often see, where you have the main body and then on top you have a lamb that's carved into the stone. Now, this was actually a fairly popular design starting in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this design would end up becoming so popular that when Sears Roebuck decided to enter into the memorial building and memorial constructing industry, they ended up selling versions of these in their catalogs. Starting one of the ones that I've seen is one of the in the 1902 catalog, for example. However, this one would have came probably much later, and possibly one of the 1915, 1916 catalogs that were selling these sorts of headstones. That or this one would have been sold by a local firm that was making these sorts of headstones at a fairly consistent rate. Now, as you can notice here, this headstone has suffered damage over the past century of being up and erect here at Oakwood. Now, you can however, even though it's been neglected a bit, you can still make out a few features, especially on the top, where you see the lamb's legs are carved in, as well as its tail, which comes down a bit, though this is horribly faded. And similarly, you can still see the head on this one, which is actually something that is not as common in this entire section, where, due to years of neglect, the heads, which are possibly one of the most fragile parts of these headstones, often break off and end up getting lost somewhere in the nearby soil, or they end up just being picked up by people going by, or what have you. And as a result, a lot of these examples end up not having their heads on them. However, this one still does, which is a miracle in its own right, especially considering that this one, which I've noticed myself, has actually fallen over before, and I've actually helped right back up. So we're going to see a few other examples, especially a couple where the heads have fallen off, and I'll explain a little bit about why that happens from time to time. This grave belongs to an Edwin Robb, who died in May of 1906. He was only 7 months and a few days old from that point. Now, as you can see here with his headstone, this is something that would have been closer to what Sears Roebuck would have offered, especially based on the base, which is one of the more common ones that you see in the early days of Sears Roebuck headstones and monuments. Now, as you notice, the head on this one is completely missing, though the legs and the tail are still quite visible. Now, the reason for that there has to do with a relatively simple fact, and that is heads usually on most monuments and statues are one of the first things to break, outside of things like limbs and anything that's protruding out of the stone itself. So, for example, for a lot of winged statues, the wings will break off first before, say, the arms or the head break off. Incidentally enough, this is why a lot of ancient statues will have their noses break off, because the nose is usually the most fragile part of the statue. And in a similar case here with these memorials, the most fragile part, the most exposed part, is the head of the lamb, and as a result, the head of the lamb will often break first and end up being lost. So As we can see with this example, the head is completely gone, though the headstone outside of this missing feature is still quite good. It's in fairly good condition outside of that one factor, in spite of the many years of degradation that has occurred. This headstone example belongs to John Frederick Everhart Jr., who was born November 4th, 1933, and then died May 16th, 1934. Not even, like, maybe 6 months old. And in this example, what you can see from the headstone is that you also see the lamb that's still carved in it, but it's not as, well defined and visible as what you would think it would be, but it's still there as well, and it's a nice little touching feature. And this represents another style that you might often see quite a lot, and that is the lamb is simply carved into the stone, as we saw with the first example. And this gives it a longer life in a certain way, where the other examples, the heads usually break off and they're more likely to fall apart. These examples, you can still visibly see the lamb as long as they aren't falling over and getting shattered and broken and aren't exposed to a lot of materials that would end up destroying the stone, such as, for example, acidic materials or basic materials. It will end up lasting for a long time and will still be very much recognizable for what it is. And in this case, you can tell it's definitely a lamb that's still on the stone itself. In these final two examples, we have on the left a Wilbur N. Whitlow, who was born October 7th and died October 21st, 1922. And on the right, we have a Rochelle L. Whitlow, who was born August 30th, 1912 and died September 2nd, 1912. And in both of these cases, you actually have what are possibly some of the most well-preserved examples of this type of headstone. Both of them have their ears still as well. They have the mouths of the face are still well defined, and even on one of them, the eyes are still somewhat visible, even after at least a century of being out here in the elements. And what ends up making these such beautiful monuments is the fact that you have these very well crafted lambs on the top that make them stand out from all the other graves and draw your attention to them. They're quite touching and meaningful monuments in their own right. And because of the existence of these monuments and because of the love these families had for these lost children, even though they may have not known them for that long, they still wanted to express their love and adoration of their lost loved ones. And so as a result, they went out their way to purchase these monuments and end up having them erected in honor of their lost children. And finally, you can notice here the sheer tragedy of this mortality rate, where possibly these two children would have came from the same mother, and both of them died at an extremely young age, and not even before they could even really get up off the ground, which adds to the overall meaning behind these. This represents a overall tragedy, a sad story in its own right, and it's one that ends up being often forgotten about, especially in the modern day world. And that's largely due to the fact that infant mortality rates have dropped over the past century or so. These children, if they had been born 20, 30 years later, would have lived on and lived long, healthy lives. It was likely that they wouldn't have died at such a young age. I'll go ahead and give my final concluding thoughts and explain a little bit more of what eventually happened to these monuments and why you don't see them being made as often anymore. To give my final concluding thoughts on this entire matter, I think it's best to go ahead and finally return back over here to the baby section towards more of the more recent examples. What eventually happened with the lamb, and is a symbol of childhood innocence, especially for that of cemeteries, is that eventually it would become phased out to an extent, at least for the most part. You don't see it as often anymore because, well, children aren't dying at the same rate as they used to in the past. And as a result, the symbol has faded over time in its overall meaning. And instead, you'll occasionally see it, such as in the example of here of Dominique Devon Warren, who fortunately passed away in 1985. It'll still occasionally occur, but what tends to take its place tends to be more personalized symbols of the person themselves. And as a result, you don't see the lamb occurring as much anymore. And because children aren't really as prone to suffering from death as they used to, due to the advancements in medical technology that we see today, they're living. They're living their lives fully, which is in many ways one of the best things to have ever happened. That's one of the miracles of modern society, is that children aren't dying at such an early age, and there aren't as many heartbroken mothers and fathers who've lost their children at such a young age, and certainly not at the rate that they used to, that they would have lost them in the past. In the end, the lamb has faded away because our society has reached a point where we finally combated a lot of the things that ended up killing children at such a young age. And in the end, that's a wonderful thing in its own right. Though in one way, I also lament the end of the usage of this as a symbol overall, because it's still a very beautiful, very powerful symbol in its own right, should be remembered for what it is, a symbol of innocence, something that we all ought preserve for our children, that sense of innocence and love that we today tend to shy away from. So that's all I have to show you today. This is going to be a little bit more of a dour version of what I usually do, but due to the topic of the subject itself, it's far more important for me to express it in a far more serious fashion than what I usually do. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day. May God bless all of you, and may God bless all these lost souls, for they were taken at such a young age, and I hope that all of them are with the Father in heaven.